Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 12 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Anaheim Ducks, in which the Sharks have lost 6-5 in a shootout. And from a casual hockey fan perspective, this was a pretty fun game to watch for sure. Very high scoring, as 10 total goals were scored, if we don't actually count the ones in the shootout that technically gave the Ducks the 6-5 win. This sets a new season high for the San Jose Sharks in terms of offense by scoring 5 in this one, and generally it was a pretty back and forth game that was decently fun to watch. However, from a sort of, level of play type of perspective, you could definitely tell that this was a game between the two worst teams in the National Hockey League, and this isn't necessarily my opinion. This is not me being harsh on the San Jose Sharks or being mean to the Anaheim Ducks. This is literally just a fact coming into today. The Sharks ranked 32nd in the league in terms of points percentage, which of course is last, and the Ducks were only one better, only ahead of the San Jose Sharks, being ranked 31st in that particular stat. And so technically, this was indeed a game between the two worst teams, and by the goals scored, you absolutely could tell. If we take a look at each and every single one of these Sharks goals, Erik Karlsson had a hat trick here tonight, extremely impressive from him, but if we look at these three goals, each one was pretty much identical to the other. These were shots from the point through traffic that didn't seem to deflect in any sort of way, that Stolarz just completely missed all 3 times. Not necessarily the most replicable goals that you could possibly have. So again, credit does have to go to Erik Karlsson, but also you do kind of have to take a look at that Ducks goaltender and say, And when it comes to the two Meier goals, the first one was a nice solo effort from Meier, but it once again makes you question what exactly the Ducks defense is doing here. Fowler takes down Meier, and that may have actually ended up being a penalty, but instead of the Ducks players touching this puck and clearing it away, Meier just sort of slides on the ice, like on his not even on his skates, and then gets back up, takes the puck and shoots it. It's as though he was like on a breakaway and then kind of fell down because the Ducks players were just completely absent from this play. And then the second Meier goal wasn't even Meier's goal. I mean, it technically ended up being, because you can't give it to the Ducks themselves, but Silfverberg completely snipes one past Anthony Stolarz here to tie that game up at 4. Clearly, Silfverberg has committed fully to the Anaheim Ducks tanking role here for this season. He wants this team to lose, and so if the Sharks weren't going to tie the game, he decides to try and do it himself, and he succeeds at that, and Meier ends up getting the credit for that goal. On the other side of things, the Ducks also scored 5 goals in regulation this game, and the Sharks, it was pretty embarrassing to watch as well. We take a look at the first Henrique goal. He just completely, a Ducks player just completely barrels through Lindblom, completely sort of outmuscles him, and then the puck comes to Henrique, and we just see sort of Kevin Labanc gliding behind him as though his controller had disconnected on this particular play, making absolutely zero effort to do anything in this situation, which gives the Ducks their first goal. Then we, of course, have the completely botched coverage from a combination of both Luke Cunnin and Matt Benning on the Ducks' second goal. The Ducks' third goal, Adam Henrique moves through the traffic cone known as Matt Benning here on this play to then make a nice move onto Kakinen to score that one. And generally, it was just a completely awful look for the Sharks defensively on all 3 of those goals. The fourth one that came in the second period wasn't too bad, because it's a bit of an awkward one as it deflects off of the body of Strome in front. But the fifth goal was, again, completely botched coverage in the defensive zone for the San Jose Sharks that allowed that game to go 5-4. And while Karlsson, of course, did end up tying it, it ends up being a San Jose Sharks loss in the end in that shootout. Speaking of the shootout, the Sharks go with Couture, Labanc, and Karlsson. Karlsson gets his shot saved. Labanc, his controller seemed to have disconnected as well in the shootout there, while Couture does score, but the Ducks only have to send over Zegras and Terry, and both of them just completely embarrass, I guess you could say, Kaapo Kähkönen in net just easily. I mean, Zegras didn't even look like he had to try. It was a completely emotionless, slowly just moves in, easily dekes him out, which was kind of funny to watch in a way, but also a bit sad as well. But in the end, the Sharks do lose, which technically, tanking wise, considering that these are, again, as I said, the two worst teams in the league statistically, actually a pretty good loss for the San Jose Sharks, even since it was still, of course, an exciting game to watch. On to the lineups here, of course, we once again had the first line of Hurdle, Meyer, and Svechnikov. I actually thought that these players would be separated just because of the big mistake that Svechnikov made against the Tampa Bay Lightning at the end of last game. But like I said, Svechnikov is not a rookie. He is not, in that age where he gets completely benched and sent down for making this massive mistake, as if we would have probably seen from a player like Thomas Bordeleau or William Eklund if they were in this particular position. And as such, he still manages to find himself on the top line with both Hurdle and Meyer, though I will mention that near the end of this game, we saw Lindblom start to get a couple of shifts with these two players. The San Jose Sharks are clearly running out of players to try on this top line with Meyer and Hurdle. They just cannot find anyone because there really is not anyone, at least not currently on the main San Jose Sharks roster, who can actually fit in decently well onto this first line, because while this first line actually did pretty well in this game, it wasn't because there was such amazing chemistry between these three players. Svechnikov did very little. Hurdle had a couple of chances, but it was mostly just Timo Meyer. Every single time he would get this puck, would just kind of fire it on net. I believe he had 10 shots on goal by the end of this game, which is a pretty crazy number, but he continues, if I'm not mistaken, to lead the league in that particular statistic. I think he was third in that stat last year, so it's not that much of a surprise, but still, he did add a couple of goals, like I mentioned earlier, even though one of them wasn't really his goal, but it was a good game for the first line on an individual level, but from a sort of team play type of level, it wasn't that great. On the second line, we once again did see some offensive looks from this line, which is definitely an improvement of where the second line was a few games ago. But it is again a type of situation where, even though I said Nieto was technically a better fit on the second line than Svechnikov was on the first line, he's still not a very good fit on the second line. And you can tell just in, on a more consistent basis, Nieto is just not really belonging in this particular situation. So I'm watching Barabanov make some really solid plays at even strength. I'm watching Couture actually be able to play off of that rather well. And then I'm watching Matt Nieto do very little in that particular position. So basically, the Sharks are running two top lines here in their top six that are completely hampered by one of their wingers, which is a big reason for why the San Jose Sharks aren't necessarily going to be scoring too many goals. And you may be saying, well, the Sharks just set a new season high with 5 this game, but how much of that was really on these top two lines compared to, not only massive mistakes from Ducks players and goaltenders, but also just the massive heroics of Erik Karlsson, who continues to pretty much single-handedly, maybe dual-handedly with a player like Meyer, carry the entirety of this team's offense. Also, maybe Nico Sturm contributes a bit into that one. Speaking of Nico Sturm, we once again have the third line, which generally seems to get a couple of good sort of shifts in the offensive zone per game. They seem to get a couple of good looks. They were actually the line that was on for the second Karlsson goal. It looked like it was going to be Nico Sturm's 6th of the season before it got taken away from him because he didn't actually get a stick on that puck. But in the defensive zone, I mean, Sturm we know is pretty fine in that role, but Bonino, even though his reputation would say he's fine in the defensive zone, he actually is not. And Luke Kunin is an absolute mess in the defensive zone, which is kind of odd because Luke Kunin gets a decent amount of penalty killing time. We saw the Sharks go shorthanded in the overtime for this game, and Logan Couture, of course, is the go-to player for that situation. But once Couture went off, Kunin stepped on, and Kunin was not terrible on the penalty kill, but when it comes to actual even strength 5-on-5 defensive play, he just looks completely lost. Generally, Kunin kind of reminds me a lot of Jonathan Dahlen last year, because when he is indeed in the offensive zone, he actually has a pretty decent shot, and he actually has an okay ability of being able to find some open ice to get some opportunities, kind of like Dahlen did last year. But in the defensive zone, he's just like, he's barely even a player at that point. And so you essentially have a Jonathan Dahlen type player for like $1.5 million more dollars, and also you've got rid of a 3rd round pick to acquire this player. And the only plus side is that he takes penalties and randomly fights people, which I guess is okay, but not, a massive sort of deal breaker for me, saying that this is such a better option than someone like Dahlin. So generally not too much of a fan of this pickup, but at the very least it is better than a different pickup that I will get to a bit later on. But first I do have to talk about the L line here that will probably be separated come next game just because of the shifts that we saw from Lindblom on the first line near at the end. But the Lindblom, Labanc, Lorentz line actually did get a couple of good chances later on. Lorentz obviously got just completely robbed by Stolarz near the end of that game. That would have been the goal that tied it up at 5, if not, but it ended up being Karlsson a couple of minutes later. But of course, they were also on the ice for that goal against the first one by the Anaheim Ducks, the first one of the game in general, where Labanc, like I said, does absolutely nothing, and Lindblom gets sort of out-muscled in that type of situation. And this is, kind of what you can expect from the L line at times. They're not necessarily the most defensively oriented type of players, which is surprising, as most of the time teams decide to aim for their fourth line to be sort of they're not going to score much, but they're also not going to give up much. But this is kind of a volatile version of a fourth line, because they might be able to pot in a goal here or there, because technically Labanc and Lindblom are offensively oriented players who may, at like sort of their best, at their ceiling, could be like third, maybe even second line type of forwards. They're just not really consistent enough to be anything more than a fourth line type of forward. But generally, this could be a line that we might be talking about a lot for good reasons, but also some bad reasons. On the defensive side of things, we of course do once again have to mention Erik Karlsson, who leads the way once more offensively for the San Jose Sharks. Not only does he record a hat trick, which is the first hat trick of his career, which was not too surprising because it's rare to see a defensive hat trick, but also kind of surprising because Erik Karlsson, has had insane offensive seasons in his career thus far. So to not have a single hat trick during that did kind of still catch me a bit by surprise for sure. And then of course we also have to add in that he had an assist here tonight as well on the first Timo Meier goal, and so that is a 4-point night for him. I believe now he moves up to a grand total of 9 goals with 15 points on the season, which is kind of close to the top of the league generally. He's not necessarily at McDavid or Draisaitl level, but he's pretty close to that. And in terms of defensive scoring, he definitely leads the league there. And so very, very impressive game once more from Erik Karlsson. Definitely has stepped into those shoes left by Brent Burns. The major issue, of course, is that when Brent Burns was the main guy for the San Jose Sharks a few years ago, the Sharks didn't have too many other options on the defensive side of things to really jump into the play. They had Vlasic, they had Braun, they had Paul Martin, Brendan Dillon, Roman Polak, if we take a look at the roster from the year that the Sharks made the Stanley Cup Finals. None of those players were necessarily going to jump into the play, but the reason that it still worked out in the end is not because that Brent Burns is so much better than what Erik Karlsson is doing here, but it's because the Sharks still had a capable offensive unit up front. The problem with the San Jose Sharks is that when Karlsson is not on the ice, literally nothing actually ends up happening besides maybe Meier single-handedly taking a shot on net that might end up being pretty good, and then the odd sort of cycling decent offensive zone shift every 10 minutes when Erik Karlsson isn't on the ice. Because when it comes to Vlasic or Benning or Shemek or Ferraro, it's either like sort of a weak pass down the boards or between the point, or just a random shot that probably misses the net that you're kind of just hoping for the best on. And while you watch Erik Karlsson at the point and you go, well, that is, some massive creativity. Just Erik Karlsson on the game-tying goal that made it 5-5, sort of faking that shot, repositioning and taking it, is probably more offensive flair than Matt Benning has showed in his entire lifetime. And so that's basically the major issue for the San Jose Sharks. Karlsson came on the ice and took like a 3-minute shift at one point, and the Sharks just dominated. Offensive zone shift for the Timo Meier line, then it transitioned into the Logan Couture line, and it still stayed in the offensive zone because of Erik Karlsson. And then as soon as he comes out the ice, where does it go? The defensive zone, because of course it does. And then finally, to briefly mention, of course, Matt Benning, because I did bring up earlier on that Luke Kunin was not the worst addition for the San Jose Sharks this offseason. It is, of course, Matt Benning. I have mentioned this multiple times before. The 4-year contract makes absolutely no sense. This game, of course, was particularly egregious in showing how Matt Benning is not a very good defenseman at the NHL level. is completely lost on the second goal, is completely lost on, well, not completely lost on the third goal, just gets completely beat on the third goal, and is once again a disappointing player to watch. And then finally, to conclude here, we of course have the Sharks goaltender Kakinen, who had definitely a bit of a rough night. Can't necessarily blame him for all of the defensive zone collapses from the San Jose Sharks, certainly, but you can't also say that a 5-goal night given up by a goaltender is in any way good. Like, obviously, I'm not going to sit here and say he was terrible tonight and the reason that the San Jose Sharks lost, but he certainly didn't do them too many favors, and in particular, kind of got, like I said, a bit embarrassed in that shootout tonight against Terry and Zegras. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, where they'll go from facing the worst, or the second worst team in the league with this Anaheim Ducks squad tonight, to facing off against the Florida Panthers, who are not necessarily the best team or the second best team in the league, but definitely a playoff squad. So the Sharks, if they couldn't handle the Ducks here tonight, they'll have to play up to their competition like they have done a couple of times this season if they want a chance there. Class dismissed.